Hello, interpreters of literature. Now, you've probably noticed right away that I am not Ms. Kopecki. Good observation. I am special guest Philip Zaborowski. I don't know if I'm a special guest, but I made the slideshow and I wanted to feel special, so that's what I'm calling myself. I am at least a guest. You'll probably all agree with that. Now, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa, and I specialize in medieval literature. That's what I want to talk to you about today, medieval literature. More specifically, probably the most famous piece of medieval literature, at least in English, Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Now, we're focusing specifically on the Miller's Tale for this, but I want to give you a little overview and note that there are 24 tales in total, and each one is told by a specific character. And each story told by that character is done in poetic form, which we'll talk about a little bit as we go along. Now, the Canterbury Tales are an unfinished document, right? Geoffrey Chaucer never got around to it. His initial plan was to have each character tell 4 tales over the course of the book itself. And with 30 characters, that would add up to 120 stories, which is a lot. He finished 24, so, 96 to go. Unfortunately, he didn't get there. Didn't reach his goal. But the ones we do have are some of the jewels of medieval literature and some of the most famous stories in the English tradition. So I've got here a picture by William Blake, which I accidentally drew on a little bit, but this is a drawing of the Canterbury Pilgrims, or it's actually, I guess, a painting. It's in color, whatever. I am not an art major. I am an English major, so bear with me. So you can see here that the breadth of the characters here that are all on this pilgrimage to Canterbury, and each one tells a tale along the way, although we didn't quite get to all of them. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, and I'm going to make my video of myself disappear so that you don't have to see me, and also because it's going to block little things I have included in the slideshow. So here we go. Okay, so normally these slideshows have a today's task section. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of email mix-up between me and Ms. Kopecki, so I wasn't able to get that on here. So I guess she is going to put that information on an icon for you. I imagine one of those tasks will be reading the Miller's Tale, which we'll talk about more as we go along. Okay, so I want to start off by giving you all a little bit of information on Geoffrey Chaucer himself. I've included over here an image of Chaucer. This is from the Ellesmere manuscript, which is one of roughly 80 surviving manuscripts that contain the Canterbury Tales. Now, a lot of these are in pretty rough condition. As you can imagine, a 600-year-old book is going to generally be in fairly rough condition, but the Ellesmere manuscript is absolutely in beautiful condition, right? And it contains these really great drawings in the margins. Now, these manuscripts in Geoffrey Chaucer's day, all books are handwritten, right? They're written by scribes and scriptoriums and copied that way, and there's no printing press yet. And a lot of these manuscripts have illuminations or miniatures, or basically these are just drawings in the margins which kind of add a little bit of flavor to the text, you could say. So this is what Chaucer kind of looked like. It's, or at least what we think he kind of looks like based on some other depictions of him. He's on his horse doing a little bit of pointing towards the text, right? And this is kind of fitting because the manuscript contains all the characters in the Canterbury Tales, and Geoffrey Chaucer himself is one of those characters. He writes himself into it, which is really fun. He tells his own tale, the tale of Sir Topaz, and it's a riot. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about Geoffrey himself. So he was an English poet, as I've mentioned, born around 1340, and he died in 1400 in London, where he spent most of his time. So in medieval history, we often know the death date of important figures, but we very rarely know that birth date because there just weren't records kept of those sorts of things at that time. So, as I said, he was a medieval poet. He's also attributed to being kind of a philosopher and astronomer. He very famously and very importantly translated the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius from Latin into the English vernacular, which kind of opened up some educational doors for people who weren't versed in Latin, which was kind of the official language of the church and education at the time, so the common folk wouldn't have known Latin for the most part, except what they picked up from church services. And that's kind of a simplification, but anyway. So also I've written down here astronomer. He was very interested in astronomy, which you'll notice in the Miller's Tale. He wrote a piece called The Treatise of the Astrolabe, which is kind of often considered one of the very first pieces of technical writing in English, which technical writing being just like kind of an instruction on how to use something. Now, he also served as a bureaucrat, a courtier, a diplomat, and a member of parliament. So there are lots of civil records of Chaucer's life because he was in these very public positions. Now, he is very often dubbed the father of English poetry or the father of English literature because, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, he's one of the first really important figures in the vernacular literature, right? He's writing in English, not the Latin or the Anglo-Norman French, right? Which were kind of the more official languages in the time leading up to Chaucer's writing period of 1360, 70, 80. So I have a couple of quotes here that I just wanted to share with you to kind of illustrate Chaucer's regard among poets to come. So the first one is, Chaucer undoubtedly did excellently in his Troilus and Cressida, of whom truly I know not whether to marvel more, either that he in that misty time could see so clearly, or that we in this clear age go so stumblingly after him. And that is in A Defense of Poesy by Philip Sidney, who was a early modern poet and obviously a fan of Chaucer's. And the second quote I've included here comes from William Caxton, who was the first publisher using a printing press in London in the 15th century. Right? He's sort of the English version of Johann Gutenberg, and he wrote of Chaucer, calling him the worshipful father and first founder and embellisher of ornate eloquence in our English. So high praise for Chaucer, which has continued over the years. Now, the Canterbury Tales themselves were written towards the end of Chaucer's life. I mentioned in the first slide that it is an unfinished document, and that is because he didn't finish it before he died. Although there are some scholars who argue that it is complete, and there's a whole debate. If there's one thing scholars like doing, it's arguing with one another about literally anything. So some unique features about the Canterbury Tales is that they're written in decasyllabic lines. Now, decasyllabic is kind of an ancestor of iambic pentameter, which you might be familiar with from Shakespeare and Milton, which you should be familiar with, right? Unstressed, stressed, 5 per line. And it is also written almost entirely in heroic couplets, which means each pair of lines finishes with an end rhyme. And we'll look at that a little more as we go along. Okay, so I want to start off by giving you some historical context. That is, I want to give you some information on the major events which occurred during Geoffrey Chaucer's life and the things that may have shaped his experience of the world and influenced his writing. I also want to make the argument that Chaucer's life experiences aren't all that different from what we're experiencing today. Chaucer is born during a period of perpetual warfare. Now, the 100 Years' War lasts for far longer than 100 years, as you'll notice if you're a math whiz. And during this time, England and France are fighting for control of France, and it lasts for so long that basically 5 generations of kings are involved in this conflict, and it contains some of the most famous battles in history, like the Battle of Agincourt, which Shakespeare will immortalize in his Henry V, and some of the most famous figures in history, like Joan of Arc, who I'm pointing an arrow at right there. Now, I also want to point out that Chaucer is coming up during an age of global pandemic, much like we're experiencing right now with COVID-19. Chaucer is a child or a young man during the peak of the Black Death, around 1350, and during this time, an estimated 40 to 60% of England's population dies from bubonic plague. Now, I don't know about their social distancing habits, but there were masks worn by the plague doctors, although probably a little bit different than the masks you may wear. So on top of the perpetual warfare and the pandemic, Chaucer's lifetime also sees mass protests and an uprising called the Peasants' Revolt. Now, so many peasant laborers die from the Black Death. There's a huge labor shortage, and those people who work the fields and grow the crops and do all of the manual labor are stretched really thin, and they're working really hard, and on top of that they're being taxed at an exorbitant amount, and this causes a series of uprisings and revolts and protests, which are known as the Peasants' Revolt, or Wat Tyler's Uprising, which I pointed an arrow right there, so that little picture you can look at. So the Peasants' Revolt, kind of the big thing that happens on the side of the peasants is that they take control of the Tower of London, and they execute a lot of royal officials. Eventually, though, the uprising is put down, but it does lead to a lot of changes in societal structure, such as getting rid of a poll tax, which was used to keep peasants from voting, as well as other reforms in the basic model of society, which, for the most part, they were rather unpaid. So there were a lot of changes during this time. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about class in the Middle Ages, because Chaucer is very interested in critiquing the class structures and satirizing them in a lot of ways throughout the Canterbury Tales. However, during the Middle Ages, instead of class distinctions, people are separated into estates. So there are 3 estates. The first is the clergy, the church folk, or those who pray. The second estate is the aristocracy, those who fight. These are the noblemen, the knights, right? And the third estate is the common folk, the peasantry. And there's a huge disparity at this time because those first 2 estates, the clergy and the aristocrats, only make up about 4% of the population, which means that 96% of the population of England at this time is the common folk, the peasantry. Now, this is a little more complicated at Chaucer's time because the merchant class is rising up and gaining power and wealth, and also there's kind of a scholarly class developing through the university systems at Oxford and Cambridge, and Chaucer kind of finds himself involved in those 2 classes, right? He's the son of a merchant, a wine merchant, and he also works as a courtier and a bureaucrat and in the government system, right? So these are things that all kind of shape his views and his critique in the Canterbury Tales. Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about Chaucer and his role in making the English vernacular a language of literature. Now, I was told by Ms. Kopecky that you guys all kind of talked about this when you were studying Dante, and so in a lot of ways, Chaucer is sort of the English Dante. He wants to make English the English vernacular a literary language. Now, this is complicated because of the history of the English language, which I'm going to give you a very brief rundown of. So, basically, pre-BC, Britain is inhabited by Celtic peoples, and their native language eventually morphs into what we now call Welsh, the modern Welsh language. Interestingly, though, Britain's history is a history of invasion. Nowadays, we kind of think of them as a colonial power who invaded other countries, but in the early days, Britain, the island itself, was constantly being invaded. And it begins, well, from what we know, it begins in 54 and 55 AD with Julius Caesar, who invades and conquers and eventually colonizes Britain. And thus Latin becomes the official language, and it retains that status because of the influence of the church. And that status basically remains up to Chaucer's day, okay? But then, beginning in the 5th century, Saxon invaders, these are peoples from Germany, the west coast of Germany, invade and establish communities in Britain, and they bring their own language to the British Isles. This Saxon language becomes the early English vernacular, or what's now called Old English. This is the language of the Beowulf poet. However, then in 1066, forces from Normandy, which is part of what is now modern-day France, under the command of William the Conqueror, invade, and as you can tell from William's name, they conquer England. And French becomes the official language of the courts, and Latin remains the language of the church, which leaves the English vernacular as just kind of flapping in the breeze. So then in 1154, the last Norman king of Britain dies, and the English vernacular, that Old English, slowly morphs into the Middle English of Chaucer, which is kind of recognizable to us today with a little bit of help, and I'm going to show you a little example of that in the next slide. Okay, so I've included here the opening lines of the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales. This is the very beginning of the book, and I have them on the left in Chaucer's Middle English, and on the right, the modern translation. So I think at this point you're probably sick of hearing my voice. So I found this video of Ms. Cracker from season 10 of RuPaul's Drag Race reciting these same 14 lines in the Middle English. So I'm going to play that for you, and you can follow along with the modern translation and see if you can kind of catch the differences. And also I just want you to listen to sort of the rhythm of the language, because some of the poetics of Chaucer's Middle English don't make it through into the modern translations.
Here beginneth the book of the Talus of Canterbury. Juan the Tavro de shore sorta, the drought of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein and which the core, of which virtue engendered is the floor. Juan Zephyrus egg with the sweet of breath, in spirit hath in every holten heifer, the tender crappus, and the youngest son hath in the ram his half for coaster and small fools mocking melodia, that sleeping on the meat of Dobania, so pretty can mature in her collages, then longing folks to go on pilgrimages, and palmers for to sake and stranders, to fair in the hallways, couth and sundry landes, and specially from every sheerest end of England to Canterbury they went. The Holy Ghost remarked for to sake that him had open when that they were sake.
Okay, so I hope that recital helped you to pick up on some of the poetics of the Middle English and the poem itself. Hopefully you noticed those heroic couplets, that decasyllabic verse, that kind of riding rhyme, which kind of in a lot of ways mirrors the sound of horse hooves. And if I had a couple coconuts, I'd be whacking them together at this moment, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I do think that Ms. Crocker kind of steps on one of my favorite line of the general prologue, the small folas mocking melody line. There's this really great tone shift there, but I don't want to be too critical because I have never tried to recite those lines while walking on the cobblestone streets of Canterbury wearing heels. So let's talk about genre for a moment. The Miller's Tale is a fabliau. And I have a definition of the fabliau here. A fabliau is a brief comic tale in verse, usually scurrilous and often scatological or obscene. The style is simple, vigorous, and straightforward. The time is the present, and the setting's real, familiar places. The characters are ordinary sorts, tradesmen, peasants, priests, students, restless wives. The plots are realistically motivated tricks and ruses. The fabliau thus present a lively image of everyday life among the middle and lower classes. Yet, that representation only seems real. Life did not run that high in actual 14th century towns and villages. It never does. And the plots, convincing though they seem, frequently involve incredible degrees of gullibility in the victims and of ingenuity and sexual appetite in the trickster heroes and heroines. And you are going to see all of this in the Miller's Tale. You are going to read a dirty story. There is lots of sex, and Chaucer kind of prepares us for that with the opening lines. It's springtime. The drought of March has been pierced by the rains of April, right? There's a very sexual undertone right from the beginning of the Canterbury Tales. All right, some themes to consider as you go forward. I borrowed the first two from Ms. Kopecki's slides on Milton's Paradise Lost. So how do knowledge and faith interact in the text? There is certainly an interaction there between Nicholas and John the Carpenter, as well as Absalom. So the second one, What does the text tell us about the apocalypse? This is a more farcical look at the apocalypse, but there is definitely some interesting tone there. How and to what extent does the Miller employ imagery, specifically animal imagery? So that's something I want you to keep in mind as you're reading through this. What are the gender politics of the text? Who wields the most power? There are a lot of gendered aspects to this text and gendered interactions that I want you to pay special attention to, or I hope that you'll pay special attention to. I have no power here. How are bodily descriptions important to the text? How does the description of the Miller's body differ from that of Alison? How are they similar? How does class, estate shape the characters' interactions? And how does the Miller's tale adhere to the genre of the fableau? How is this a dirty story? Is it a dirty story? It is. I'm just going to spoil that for you. It's a dirty story. All right, we're going to start our work with the text by looking at the Miller himself. Now, this is an image of the Miller from the Ellesmere manuscript, which you'll remember from the first slide on Chaucer. So this is kind of a depiction of him. Here he is with riding along on his horse, playing a set of bagpipes. He's got a little buckler shield there and a sword. And that's the Miller. That is our storyteller for this tale. All right, so I want to start our close reading by looking at the description of the Miller from the general prologue. Now, in the general prologue, Chaucer gives us a description of all the pilgrims that are on their way to Canterbury, and this is the Miller's description. What I have here is a interlinear translation done by Larry Benson from Harvard, and basically the Middle English line is followed by the Modern English line. So I'm going to read the Middle English, and then we'll look at some things a little closer together. And you can follow along with the contemporary English, or if you want to try to read the Middle English with me, that's great. So let's go. The Miller was a stout carle for the Nonas. Full big he was of brawn and eke of bonas, that proved well for over all there he came. At wrestling he would always have the ram. He was short-shouldered, broad, a thick and narrow. There was no door that he know'd have of horror, or break it at a reining with his head. His beard as any sow or fox was red, and thereto broad as though it were a sparrow. Upon the cup right of his nose he had a werter, and thereon stood a tuft of hairs, reed as the bristles of a sowe's ears. His nostrils blake were and wade, a sword and a buckler bar he by his side. His mouth was great as a great furnace. He was a jangler and a gollardays, and that was most of seen in harlotries. Well could he steal in corn and toll in thrice, and yet he had a thumb of gold per day. A waistcoat and a blue hood weared he. A bagpipe, well could he blow and son, and therewithal he brought us out of Tona. Okay, so let's dig right into this. What do we notice about the Miller? He's stout. He's big. Brawn and also of bones, right? From Iowa, what are we known for in Iowa besides corn? Wrestling. He's a great wrestler. And wrestling is important for a class satire like this. The historian Stephen Justice from the University of California, Berkeley, has written extensively on the importance of wrestling because it was the one activity in which peasants could compete against noblemen, right? They couldn't joust, they couldn't compete at tournaments, but they could wrestle. He's broad and thick. There's no door he can't knock off its hinges or break it out of running with his head, right? So this is kind of, I think that's an interesting description, right, of his head, how he uses his head to knock down doors. We're clearly seeing that this peasant person, the miller is defined by his body and not his mind, right? This point is very much being drawn out throughout the description. So we also get he's maybe not the most appealing person. He's got some red hair, which isn't a bad thing. I'm not going to be anti-ginger here. But he's got a big wart on his nose, right? He's got a wart there. He's got red hair all over his nose. His nostrils are big and black and wide. He's also armed. He carries a sword and a buckler, right? So he's prepared to battle. But he's also maybe not the most trustworthy of people, right? So it says he's got a lot of sins and deeds of harlotry. He's a drunkard, right? He's a person that hangs out in bars and, that sort of thing. And also, maybe a bit of a cheat. He knows how to steal corn and take payment 3 times, right? So he's a miller. He's grinding corn, and corn in this context is wheat, right? This is before trade with America has been established, so there's no corn or maize in England. Corn here means wheat. But he mills the wheat from the peasants bring to him, and he charges them 3 times for it. This is not a good guy. And worst of all, he's got a bagpipe. He's playing bagpipes, the most obnoxious of all instruments. But despite all his shortcomings, he's the one bringing them out of town. He's the leader of the party at this point, which includes a knight, an actual knight, and his son. So keep in mind all these qualities about the miller as you read his tale. You know that he's not the most trustworthy sort. That might play into his tale as well. So in stark contrast to this description of the miller, we have Chaucer's description of Alyson in the Miller's Tale. And Chaucer describes her through the usage of a time-honored poetic tradition called the blazon. Now, a blazon is a term which comes from heraldry. These are the images that you will see on shields in any sort of medieval-themed show like Game of Thrones, right? The lion image on Jaime Lannister's shield. But in poetry, it's used to denote a descriptive genre that became popular in France. And basically, the blazon is a lavish, extravagant praise of the parts of a woman's body. And Chaucer gives us one of the most famous ones in his description of Alyson. So the blazon is, in a lot of ways, kind of like that shot you would see in movies, especially movies from like the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, where the female love interest first appears on screen and the camera kind of runs up and down her body, right? It's kind of the film version of the male gaze, right? And the blazon is the poetic version of that, sort of. Now, I mentioned that blazons typically begin at the eyes, but that doesn't happen here. So I want you to pay attention to that. Look out for that. Where is Chaucer drawing our view? Where is he pointing the camera in this blazon? So I'm going to read through this and then mark up some stuff that I want to come back to as I go along, or anything I miss I will mark up afterwards and come back to. So here goes. Young, comely was this wife, a lovely girl, her body slim and supple as a weasel. She wore a cross-striped sash, all made of silk, an apron also, white as morning milk, she wore about her loins. Gourd de flare, white was her smock, its collar, front and back, embroidered with black silk, inside and out. The ribbons of the white cap that she wore were also coal-black silk, to match the collar. She'd a broad silken headband set back high, and certainly she'd a come-hither eye. Plucked to a slender line were her eyebrows, and they were arched and black as any sloe's. Sweeter was she by far to look upon than is a pear tree in its early bloom, and softer than the wool upon a wether. And from her girdle hung a purse of leather, tasseled with silk, spangled with beads of brass. Roam the world up and down, you'd never raise a man whose wit and fancy could dream up a prettier puppet or a girl like that? Brighter the brilliance of her coloring than a new minted tower sovereign. But when she sang, it was as brisk and clear as any swallow perching on a barn. And she would skip and frolic and make play, like any kid or calf behind its dam. Her mouth was sweet as mead or ale and honey, or store of apples laid in heather or hay. She was as skittish as a frisky colt, tall as a mast, straight as a crossbow bolt. She wore a brooch upon her lower collar, broad as the boss upon a shield or buckler. The shoes upon her legs were laced up high. She was a peach, a dolly, and a daisy, fit for a prince to lay upon his bed, or for some good retainer of his to wed. Okay, so as I mentioned, the typical romantic blazon begins with the eyes and works its way down. But here it doesn't, that's not what happens, right? Chaucer points the camera specifically right at her loins and then moves up to the smock she's wearing and its collar, right? He is pointing the camera at all her feminine wiles. And basically what he's letting us know is from the beginning, this is not a romantic story. This is a story about sex. She has a come hither eye, plucked slender line of eyebrows. He takes us back to the waist again at her loins with the girdle and the purse hanging there. He draws our attention back there again. Right? So this is clearly going to be a story about a young sexual woman. Now, I also want you to pay close attention to all the comparisons to animals in here, all those similes. She's supple as a weasel, right? She sings like a swallow, like any kid or calf, any baby goat or baby milk behind its dam. She's as skittish as a frisky colt. A colt is a young horse, right? Think about how all these animal comparisons play into the objectification or the sexualization of Alyson. Finally, I want to point you out to the last two lines where some of that class critique comes in on Chaucer's part, right? Alyson is fit for a prince's bed or for one of his retainers to wed, right? She's good enough for a nobleman to have sex with, but not good enough for him to settle down with. So I hope that by looking really closely at this blazon of Alyson, that it will help you to work your way through the rest of the tale. And I just want to say thank you for listening to me for so very long. I went a little longer than I'd hoped to. So hopefully you skipped over the parts that weren't helpful and focused on the ones that were. Have a great summer. Stay safe.